Most students at Cachacolo Secondary and Wimby Primary stopped going to school during the famine. After I dropped out, Gilbert continued to go to classes, and he told me that each day fewer and fewer classmates showed up. The teachers would call recess around 9 a.m., then disappear themselves into the fields and trading center to search for food. By February, there was no school at all. But as the dough and pumpkins became ready, the district slowly reclaimed its energy. Students began returning to school and classes resumed. But because my family still couldn't afford my school fees, I was forced to stay home doing nothing. Besides some weeding, there wasn't even much work to do in the fields until the maize harvest, still 2 months away. I started wasting time in the trading center playing bawo. Someone also taught me a wonderful game called chess, which I started playing every day. But chess and bawo weren't enough to keep my mind occupied. I needed a better hobby, something to trick my brain into being happy. I missed school so terribly. I remembered that the previous year, a group called the Malawi Teacher Training Activity had opened a small library in Wimby Primary School that was stocked with books donated by the American government. Perhaps reading could keep my brain from getting soft while being a dropout. The library was in a small room near the main office. A woman was sitting behind a desk when I walked in. She smiled. "Come to borrow some books?" she said. This was Mrs. Edith Sicelo, a teacher at Wimby who taught English and social studies and also operated the library. I nodded yes, then asked, "What are the rules of this place?" I'd never used such a facility. Mrs. Sicelo took me behind a curtain to a smaller room where three floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with books. It smelled sweet and musty, like nothing I'd ever encountered. I took another deep breath. Mrs. Sicelo then explained the rules for borrowing books and showed me the collection. I'd expected to find nothing but primary readers and textbooks, boring things. But to my surprise, I saw American textbooks on English, history, and science, secondary texts from Zambia and Zimbabwe, and novels for leisurely reading. I spent the day combing through the books while Mrs. Sicelo graded papers at her desk. Despite the variety of titles, I left the afternoon with books on geography, social studies, and basic spelling, the same textbooks my friends were studying in school. It was the end of the term, and my hope was to get caught up before classes started again. At home, I planted a thick blue gum pole deep in the ground near the mango tree out front and made my own hammock out of knotted maize sacks. For the next 3 weeks, I began a rigorous course in independent study, visiting the library in the mornings and spending the afternoons reading in the shade. Gilbert offered to help right away. Each day I met him after school and he told me what they'd done in school. "What did you cover in geography?" "Weather patterns." "Can I get your notes tomorrow?" "For sure. Thanks. I'll have the others back soon. I'm almost finished." "No problem." Reading on my own was often difficult. For one, my English was very poor, and sounding out words took a lot of time and energy. Plus, some of the material was confusing, and it would have helped to have a teacher to explain things. In agriculture, I asked Gilbert, "What do they mean by weathering?" "It's when the rains disintegrate the rocks and soil." "Oh, right. Thanks." One Saturday, Gilbert met me in the library and we flipped through books we thought might be fun. I couldn't study all the time. One book that caught my attention was the Malawi Junior Integrated Science book, used by Form 4 students. I thought, and flipped it open. There were lots of pictures and diagrams, which I found easy to understand. I saw pictures of cancer and scabies and children stricken with kwashiorkor, like so many who'd wandered the country. One picture had a man in a shiny silver suit walking on the moon. "What's happening here?" I asked Gilbert. "Why is he wearing this?" "Looks cold," he said. Turning the pages, I came across a picture of Nkulu Falls on the Shire River located in southern Malawi. I'd always heard about the hydro plants, but never knew how they worked. Simply by asking enough people in the trading center and at home, I knew that water from the river flowed down the country until it reached the Eskom plant, where it produced electricity. But how and why this worked, I had no clue. The book described how the water turned a giant wheel at a plant called a turbine, which in turn produced the electricity. Well, this seemed like the same concept as the bicycle dynamo. Behind my house, there was the dambo, and sometimes if the rain was heavy, we'd see a small waterfall. Perhaps if I had a dynamo, I could put it under the waterfall and make it spin. Then I'd have electricity. The only problem was that the dambo was just a soggy bog the rest of the year, and even in the rainy season, I'd have to run very long wires to my house to enjoy my music. That alone would cost a farmer's pay for an entire year. Gilbert and I found another book called Explaining Physics. To my delight, it also used pictures and illustrations, mainly from England, to answer some of the questions I'd had for a long time, such as how engines burned petrol in order to move. Another illustration explained how brakes in a car worked. I'd always wondered if cars used strips of rubber to stop the wheels, like a bicycle. The book said otherwise. Vacuum brakes, I said. I need to borrow this book. Yeah, for sure. But explaining physics was much more difficult to read than integrated science. It was filled with long and complicated words and phrases. Over the next week, I struggled with the text but managed to figure out every few words and was able to grasp the context. For instance, I'd be interested in an illustration labeled Figure 10, so I'd go through the text until I found where Figure 10 was mentioned and study the sentences around it. For words that had no translation in Chichewa, I'd write them down and go to Mrs. Sicolo. Can you look up the word electroscope in the dictionary? Okay, she said. Any others? Kinetic energy and diode. I think you're going above and beyond your fellow students. They're not studying this stuff. I know, but I want to know about this. Well, keep it up. Come back if you need more help. After 2 more weeks of reading this book, I found the most fascinating chapter, the discussion of magnets. I knew about magnets because they were used to make speakers and radios. I'd busted off a few and taken them to school as toys, moving little slivers of metal around through a piece of paper. But as I read further, I discovered that some magnets, called electromagnets, are used to generate electricity, specifically in simple motors like those found in a radio. I also knew about the magnets' opposing sides, that if you had 2 magnets, one side would always fight the other, refusing to stick together. However, flip one of the magnets over and it will snap to its fellow magnet. This book explained that all magnets have north and south poles. The north pole of the magnet will always attract the south pole, while 2 similar poles will push away from each other. Because of its liquid iron core, the Earth itself is a kind of large bar magnet with magnetic north and south poles. Magnets, just like the Earth, have natural magnetic fields that radiate between the poles. These lines are invisible, of course, but if you were to see them, they'd always be pulled toward the magnetic north pole of the Earth. This is how a compass works. Inside, there's a small bar magnet that finds the north and keeps you from getting lost. The book also showed how to make magnets out of everyday objects such as nails, wire, and dry cells. When electricity from a power source, such as a battery, passes through a wire, it creates its own kind of natural magnetic field around the wire. This magnetic field can become even greater if that wire is coiled around a good conductor, like a nail. The magnetic field will become even stronger depending on the number of times the wire is wrapped around the nail. Because of this, electromagnets have many uses. They can be used as giant magnets to pick up cars and heavy pieces of metal, while smaller electromagnets help power the simple motors found in many things around us: radios, appliances, alternators, and cars. In a simple electric motor, a coil of wire on a shaft is housed inside a large magnet. When the coil is connected to a battery and becomes magnetized, it creates a kind of fight with the larger magnet. The push and pull between these 2 magnetic fields causes the shaft to spin. Take, for instance, the fan that we use in hot weather. The blades spin round and round because there's a fight going on inside the fan. The book said that if a power source can create this spinning motion, like in the fan, it can also cause the opposite to happen. Just as electricity causes a coil to become magnetic, a spinning coil that cuts a magnetic field will itself produce electricity. When a coil of wire rotates inside a magnetic field, it will produce a pulse of current. If a wire is connected to the coil, you can capture that pulse. This is called electromagnetic induction, and it produces alternating current, or AC, since the direction of the current is changing. With electricity, you also have direct current, or DC, which is mostly found in batteries. It flows in one direction from one end of a battery to the other through a bulb, or whatever load it's powering, to complete the circuit. But most electricity found in your home is alternating current, produced by a giant spinning coil somewhere in a power station. The best example of an AC generator given by the book was a bicycle dynamo. The movement energy is provided by the rider, the science book said. Of course, I thought. This is how spinning motion generates power, both in the dynamo and in the hydro plant. I can't tell you how exciting I thought this was. Even if the words sometimes confused me, the concepts that were illustrated in the drawings were clear and real in my mind. The various symbols, those for positive and negative, dry cells and switches in a circuit, and arrows indicating direction of current, made perfect sense and needed no explanation. And through them, I was able to grasp principles like magnetism and induction and the differences between AC and DC. It was as if my brain had long ago made a place for these symbols, and once I discovered them in these books, they snapped right into place. I kept this book for a month and studied it daily, most often while ignoring my independent studies. It was like delicious food, and I seemed to want to share my knowledge with everyone I encountered. In the video show one day, the only television working was a black and white one, and some patrons were getting upset. "Make it color," one said. "I want to see the colors." "But it's a black and white television," the owner answered. "It looks like the other one, so make it color. It's all the same." "Excuse me," I interrupted. "It's really not the same. A color television uses 3 electron tubes and a screen with fluorescence. It's right here in my book." After about a month, the school term finally ended and Gilbert was free to hang out. One morning we went to the library to kill some time. We often stayed for hours, just sitting in chairs and reading. But today, Mrs. Sicelo was in a rush. "You boys spend hours in here taking my time," she said. "But today I have an appointment. Just find something quickly." "Yes, madam." The reason it took so long was that none of the books were arranged properly. The titles weren't shelved alphabetically or by subject or author, which meant we had to scan every title to find something we liked. So that day, while Gilbert and I looked for a good read, I remembered an English word I'd stumbled across in one of my books. "Gilbert, what's the word grapes mean?" He said. "Never heard of it. Look it up in the dictionary." The English Chichewa dictionaries were actually kept on the bottom shelf, but I never really spent much time looking down there. Instead, I asked Mrs. Sicelo. So I squatted down to grab one of the dictionaries, and when I did, I noticed a book I'd never seen, pushed into the shelf and slightly concealed. "What is this?" I thought. Pulling it out, I saw that it was an American textbook called Using Energy, and this book has since changed my life. The cover featured a long row of windmills, though at the time I had no idea what a windmill was. All I saw were tall white towers with 3 blades spinning like a giant fan. They looked like the pinwheel toys Jeffrey and I once made as kids when we were bored. We'd find the old water bottles people threw away in the trading center, cut the plastic into blades like a fan, put a nail through the center attached to a stick. When the wind blew, they would spin. That's it, just a stupid pinwheel. But the fans on this book were not toys. They were giant, beautiful machines that towered into the sky, so powerful that they made the photo itself appear to be in motion. I opened the book and began to read. "Energy is all around you every day," it said. "Sometimes energy needs to be converted to another form before it is useful to us. How can we convert forms of energy? Read on and you'll see." I read on. "Imagine that hostile forces have invaded your town and defeat seems certain. If you need a hero to save the day, it's unlikely you would go to the nearest university and drag a scientist to the battlefront. Yet, according to legend, it was not a general who saved the Greek city of Syracuse when the Roman fleet attacked it in 214 BC. It explained how Archimedes used his death ray, which was really a lot of mirrors, to reflect the sun onto the enemy ships until, one by one, they caught fire and sank. That was an example of how you can use the sun to produce energy. Just like with the sun, windmills could also be used to generate power. People throughout Europe and the Middle East used windmills for pumping water and grinding grain, it said. When many wind machines are grouped together in wind farms, they can generate as much electricity as a power plant." Suddenly, it all snapped together. The blades on these windmills were driven by the wind, much like our toys. In my mind, I saw the dynamo, saw myself with a neighbor's bicycle those many nights ago, spinning the pedals so I could listen to the radio, thinking, what can spin the pedals for me so I can dance? "The movement energy is provided by the rider," the book had said, explaining the dynamo. Yes, of course, I thought, and the rider is the wind. The wind would spin the blades of the windmill, rotating the magnets in a dynamo and create electricity. Attach a wire to the dynamo and you could power anything, especially a bulb. All I needed was a windmill, and then I could have lights. No more kerosene lamps that burned our eyes and sent us gasping for breath. With a windmill, I could stay awake at night reading instead of going to bed at 7 with the rest of Malawi. But most important, a windmill could also rotate a pump for water and irrigation. Having just come out of the hunger, and with famine still affecting many parts of the country, the idea of a water pump now seemed incredibly necessary. If we hooked it up to our shallow well at home, a water pump could allow us to harvest twice a year. While the rest of Malawi went hungry during December and January, we'd be hauling in our second crop of maize. It meant no more watering tobacco nursery beds in the dambo, which broke your back and wasted time. A windmill, a pump, could also provide my family with year-round garden where my mother could grow things like tomatoes, Irish potatoes, cabbage, mustards, and soybeans, both to eat and sell in the market. No more skipping breakfast, no more dropping out of school. With a windmill, we'd finally release ourselves from the troubles of darkness and hunger. In Malawi, the wind was one of the few consistent things given to us by God, blowing in the treetops day and night. A windmill meant more than just power. It was freedom. Standing there looking at this book, I decided I would build my own windmill. I never built anything like it before, but I knew if windmills existed on the cover of that book, it meant another person had built them. After looking at it that way, I felt confident I could build one too. I could picture the windmill I wanted to build, but before I attempted something that big, I wanted to experiment with a small model first. From studying the pictures in the book, I knew that in terms of materials, I'd need blades, a shaft, and a rotor, plus some wires and something like a dynamo to generate electricity from the movement of the blades. Jeffrey and I had used a regular water bottle for those pinwheels we'd made as kids, but now I needed something stronger. I'd seen Melis and Rose playing cricket with an empty plastic jar of body care perfume jelly, so I went and grabbed it. The jar was shaped like a round tub of margarine with a screw-top lid. It was perfect. Leaving the lid intact, I sawed off the bottom of the jar with a bow saw, then cut the sides into 4 large strips, then fanned them out into blades. I poked a hole through the center of the lid and nailed it to one of the bamboo poles my father was saving for tobacco shelters. I planted the pole in the ground behind the kitchen, but the wind hardly moved this contraption at all because the blades were too short. I needed extensions. The floors in our bathhouses often filled with water, so we installed PVC pipes to serve as a drain. Several years earlier, a bathhouse behind my Aunt Chrissy's place collapsed, and they simply built another one beside it. I knew there was a piece of pipe still buried under the bricks, and after 20 minutes of digging around, I managed to pull it free. I sawed off a long section of it, then cut it down the middle from top to bottom. I stoked the fire in my mother's kitchen, getting it very hot, then held the pipe over the coals. Soon it began to warp and blacken, becoming soft and easy to bend, like wet banana leaves. Before the plastic could cool, I placed it on the ground and pressed it flat with a piece of iron sheet. Using the saw, I then carved 4 blades, each one maybe 20 centimeters long. I didn't have a drill, so I had to make my own. First, I heated a long nail in the fire, then drove it through a maize cob, creating a handle. I placed the nail back on the coals until it became red hot, then used it to bore holes into both sets of plastic blades. I then wired them together. I didn't have any pliers, so I used 2 bicycle spokes to bend and tighten the wires on the blades. That's when my mother came up behind me. "What are you doing messing in my kitchen?" she said. "Get these toys out of here." I tried to explain about windmills and my plan to generate power, but all she saw were some pieces of plastic stuck to a bamboo stick. "Even children do more sensible things," she said. "Go help your father in the fields." "I'm building something." "Something what?" "For the future." "I'll tell you something about the future." It was pointless to explain. What I needed now was a bicycle dynamo or some kind of generator, and I had no idea where I was going to find such a thing. For 2 days, I tried to figure out how I could get a dynamo. I knew I could buy one, but where would I get the money? A trader named Dodd had one for sale in his hardware shop in the trading center. I'd seen it there in the months before the famine. It hung on a shelf, shiny in silver and wrapped in plastic. It was beautiful. I went back this time, and sure enough, there it was. Dodd stood between us, dressed in his round muslin hat and long robe. I tried my charm. "Fine day, Mr. Dodd." "Yes, fine day." "Your family?" "Oh, fine, thank you." "How much for that dynamo behind you?" 500. Yes, but you see, I don't have 500. He laughed. You know how it works. Go find the money and come back. It will still be here. And if not, I can order another. I could get money by working Ganyu. At the time, guys were making 100 kwacha unloading trucks at Chipiku store, so I headed there. If I worked a whole week, I could have enough. I waited outside the store all morning and into the afternoon. The sun was dreadful and I had no water. Finally, the owner walked outside and saw me. Why are you standing here? He said. Waiting for trucks. Trucks come every day, he said, except Monday. It was Monday. That night at home, I hit upon another idea. The bicycle dynamo was the ideal generator for the bigger windmill I wanted to create, and at some point I'd have to work for the money to buy it. But for this experimental model, I could get by with using a much smaller generator, and I knew just where to find that. I walked over to Jeffrey's house and found him in his room. Hey, Bambo, do you remember where we put that international radio cassette player? Yeah, it's here someplace. Why? I want to extract its motor and use it to generate electricity. Electricity? Yeah, from a windmill. Every time Gilbert and I had visited the library, Jeffrey was too busy working the fields. He hadn't been that interested in going anyway. We're headed to the library, we'd say. Want to go? Go ahead, he'd answer. Waste your time. But now, when I told him my idea of building a windmill that would produce power, and then showed him what I'd built so far, he saw things differently. Cool. Where did you get such an idea? The library. Using a flathead screwdriver we'd hammered out of a bicycle spoke, I removed the screws from the international radio cover and tossed it aside. I removed the cassette deck, and behind it, I found the radio motor. It was half as long as my index finger and as round as a AA battery. A piece of metal stuck out from the top like a stem, attached to a small copper pulley wheel that hoisted a thin rubber belt. I carefully extracted the motor. With some wire, I attached the motor to the bamboo so the copper wheel and the body care lid would lock together side by side like two gears. But when I spun the lid, it slipped against the copper wheel. I needed some friction to make them catch. What we need is some rubber, I said. Where do we get it? I don't know. What about the heel of a shoe? The rubber from our flip-flops was too spongy and not durable enough. Otherwise, we'd be set. Everyone wore those. We needed a different kind of rubber, the kind Jeffrey had mentioned, that was used on a durable rubber flats worn by many women in Malawi. But it wasn't going to be easy to find those shoes. A company called Shore Rubber had been going through the villages collecting women's old rubber shoes to recycle and make new ones. They were offering a half kilo of salt for each pair, so of course most women were taking the deal. But this was the perfect rubber for my windmill, and I was determined to find some. All day, Jeffrey and I dug through the rubbish pits at his house, Aunt Chrissy's house, Socrates' house, and finally my house, looking for shoes. Finally, after hours spent rummaging through mango skins, ground nut shells, banana peels, Jeffrey held up a shoe. One shoe. Tonga! The black shoe had been buried for so long it was now gray and covered in a layer of dirt and muck. Good job, chap, I said. Using my iron sheet knife, I carved a tiny O-shaped piece out of the rubber, small enough to slide over the motor's copper wheel like a cap. This took me an hour. Once I'd pressed it on, the two gears caught just right and spun together. The next step was to test the motor to see if it produced current. With Jeffrey spinning the blades by hand, I took the motor's two wires and touched them to my tongue. Feel anything? Asked Jeffrey. Yeah, tickles, I said. Good. Without stealing a radio from my father, the only functional radio we had was Jeffrey's Panasonic, which he used when he was working in the fields. Jeffrey loved his Billy Counda music, and often I'd sneak up on him in the maize rows and catch him dancing. I held the pole and fan in place while Jeffrey popped off the Panasonic's battery cover and removed the cells. Without them, we'd need to connect the two wires to the battery's positive and negative heads. Using my knowledge from the books, I assumed that because the radio operated on batteries, its motor produced DC power, unlike the dynamo on my father's friend's bicycle I played with months before, which produced AC power and only worked when connected to the radio's AC plug. How do I know which head is positive or negative? Jeffrey asked. If you connect the wires and hear music, you got the right one. Whatever you say, here it goes. He pushed the wires inside, then twisted them so they connected to the heads. What do we do now? He asked. Now we wait for the wind. Then, just as I was saying that, the wind began to blow. My blades started to spin, and the wheel began to turn. The radio began to pop and whistle, and suddenly there was music. It was my new favorite group, the Black Missionaries, on Radio 2, singing their great song, We Are Chosen, just like Moses. I jumped up so high I nearly disconnected the wires. You hear that, man? I screamed. We did it. It actually worked. At last, Jeffrey yelled out. Now I'll go even bigger. Superpower. Yeah. With that little success, I started planning for an even bigger windmill. That model had already revealed itself in my mind, so there was no need to draw it out. The picture was of a much larger machine, which still used PVC pipe as blades. For the rotor, I'd need some kind of strong flat metal disc. For the shaft, I'd use the bottom bracket or axle of a bicycle, what we call the gav, that connected the crankset and allowed the sprocket, cranks, and pedals to rotate. My plan was to cut the entire crankset off a bike, reduce the size while leaving the back wheel intact. The blades would somehow be attached to the gav and act as pedals. When the wind blew, the blades, sprocket, and chain would spin, rotating the back wheel and turning the dynamo. I'm not sure where I got my confidence, but I knew this was a great plan. However, I had none of the materials I needed or the money to buy them. So to pull this off, I had to do what I did with my radio experiment. I had to go and find them on my own. For the next month, I woke up early and went in search of windmill pieces, like exploring for treasure. The materials had to be strong and metal, and the best place to look was the tobacco plantation at Estate 24, just across from the Cachacolo School. The estate had an abandoned garage and scrapyard that was littered with machine parts and stripped bodies of cars and tractors, all forgotten and left to rust. I'd gone there a few times with Gilbert before the start of secondary school, after hearing the bullies at Cachacolo were even meaner than those at Wemby Primary. We looked for something to use for a weight bench in order to become muscular, like our great hero at the time, the Chinese martial artist Bolo Yeung from Bloodsport, a film the video show couldn't play enough for our satisfaction. Can you lift this metal like Bolo, I'd say, straining against a rusty engine block? For sure, said Gilbert. Stand aside. We'd spent a few days trying to lift the heaviest pieces in the yard, but needless to say, the famine arrived and we never built the bench. But now I was returning to the yard to build my new machine. I took the long walk to Cachacolo over the hills and streams. The land hadn't changed much since the start of the famine. The grasses were still high and starting to fade to brown, but the maize in the fields was now tall and green. Soon we'd be harvesting and our problems would be over, at least for this year. I turned into the estate entrance once I reached the school. Within a few meters, I entered the scrapyard and stopped. Behold! Now that I had an actual purpose and a plan, I realized how much bounty lay before me. There were so many things: old water pumps, tractor rims half the size of my body, filters, hoses, pipes, and plows. The stripped chassis of several touring cars lay bleached by the sun, in addition to 2 abandoned tractors. Their blue paint had long ago chipped and faded. The tractors had no tires or engines, just a rusted gearbox in their bellies. The steering wheels were still intact, as well as the gear shift and brake pedals. The clutch was a small button on the wheel next to a lever that worked as a gas pedal. The glass was busted off the instrument panels. The tall grass swallowed everything. I've struck gold, I thought. Even better, the scrapyard was incredibly quiet, and I was beautifully alone. The first afternoon, I discovered a large tractor fan lying in the grass outside the garage. It was the ideal design for my rotor and would allow me to bolt the plastic windmill blades directly to the metal blades of the fan. That same day, I found a giant shock absorber, also from a tractor. I banged it against an engine block to knock off the casing. It fell away, revealing a piston I could easily weld to the fan to create the perfect shaft. I needed some kind of ball bearing to connect the shock absorber and gav to reduce the friction. In order to find the right size bearing, I took a piece of rope and measured the end of the shock absorber that went around to all the junk in the scrapyard and compared it to the various shafts with bearings attached. After 3 days, I found the right match on an old groundnut grinding machine. I found a rusted coil spring and used it to bang the bearing loose. This took me all day because I had to take my time and be careful not to break it. After a couple of hours, the constant banging against metal caused me to get blisters on my hands that soon burst and bled. To endure the pain and keep banging, I imagined I was Bolo, burying his hands in hot sand to make them hard as steel. These mind games seemed to do the trick, and I was finally able to knock the bearing loose. My careful work paid off. It was in pristine condition. As I mentioned, the scrapyard sat directly across from Cachacolo Secondary School, where I'd left a bit of my heart those many weeks ago. The school was now empty because the students were preparing for the second term, which started in only a few short weeks. I could see through the windows and imagined myself sitting in one of the empty desks. Back at home, my father's tobacco was still drying under the shelters. Having made it through the famine, I hoped that once the crop was ready, it would fetch a good price at auction. We could finally settle our debts and pay my fees, and all my sorrows of being a dropout would melt away. I would return to school, and this time I would be ready. "Look out," I said. "Your man Kamkwamba will be back soon."